huge honor to be in partnership with Busboys and Poets. I want to thank Andy and his team for being in partnership with us. We've been running a Gaza lecture series starting at the beginning of this year, and we're probably going to continue the lecture series. And every time we bring in a speaker to speak at Georgetown, we do an evening conversation with the speaker, and it's great to have a community space here, knowing that, you know, outside forces that don't believe in the values that we believe in can't intimidate the owner of the bookstore to shut us down, as has happened many times in the past. So thank you, Andy, for your commitment to this cause and this issue. I want to begin by saluting the beautiful idealism, the self-sacrifice and the courage of American students across this country who've set up solidarity camps in support of the people of Gaza. We just came from the DC Gaza encampment on the campus of George Washington University, and Ussama Makdisi and his brother, who's here tonight, conducted what I thought was a really powerful and moving teach-in with the students who were protesting, and have captured all of our hearts and imagination. It was a wonderful sort of moment of grassroots solidarity, of deep democracy, that I wish, you know, could have continued longer, but we had to end it because we had an evening engagement here. So that conversation, I think, is going to be posted online. You can probably search for it or email me and I'll get you the link. So it's a huge honor to have with us tonight as a guest speaker, Professor Ussama Makdisi. In terms of his formal title, Professor Makdisi is Professor of History and Chancellor's Chair at the University of California, Berkeley. He was previously Professor of History and the first holder of the African American Educational Foundation Chair, Educational Foundation Chair of Arab Studies at Rice University in Houston. He's the author of several outstanding books, most recently Age of Coexistence, The Ecumenical Frame, and the Making of the Modern Arab World. His previous book was called A Faith Misplaced, The Broken Promise of U.S.-Arab Relations, 1820 to 2001. And his earlier book, Artillery of Heaven, American Missionaries and the Failed Conversion of the Middle East, won numerous prestigious awards. I encourage you to track down those books and read them. Since October the 7th, Professor Makdisi's social media presence has been very inspiring. I encourage you to check out his Twitter page. He also has started a podcast with his brother called the Makdisi Street Podcast. I encourage you to check that out as a resource. And it's great to be with him tonight because I view Ussama and his brother to be some of the two sort of intellectual pillars of this moment in time in terms of a just resolution of the question of Palestine and Israel-Palestine conflict more broadly. So it's great to be with Ussama on stage. And so since this event was advertised as under the title of Zionism, Liberalism, and Genocide, which was the initial title that Ussama gave me, I thought I would begin by asking you to speak about the historic relationship between these ideas. Zionism, liberalism, and genocide. There is an assumption that these two things, you know, produce, at the end of the day, mass violence against Palestinians. Is that necessarily the case? How can we think about the relationship of this evolution? Because it certainly looks like that in terms of what we're seeing in Gaza today, and the reaction of, you know, liberal governments and liberal intellectuals, and the mainstream Zionist expression as we see it in the State of Israel. But these are powerful, complex, historic movements and moments in time: Zionism, liberalism, and of course genocide. So how can we think about the relationship in some sort of historic way? Since you're a historian, I thought I'd begin to ask you to reflect on that relationship.
Yeah, thank you, Nader. It's great to be here, and I'm sorry we were a little bit late, but we were speaking to students, my brother and I, Seti, were speaking to students. In terms of the question about Zionism and genocide and liberalism, I think the point of any scholar or any historian who knows the history of Palestine or the history of the Middle East understands that Zionism emerged in Europe in the 19th century as a political movement, largely in response to European anti-Semitism. In other words, the question and the anxiety and the fear and the policies that were anti-Jewish that were being pursued in Europe against Jewish citizens and individuals and groups in Europe. And that eventually, And that this movement, the Zionist movement that developed in Europe, decided eventually to as of 1897, decided to actually locate this ideal that they had of a Jewish state in Palestine. And of course, so the question of Zionism and genocide is tied both in the sense of European racism pushing certain European Jews to create this idea of a Jewish state. That's one thing. Second thing, the idea of, so in other words, European racism against Jews. And then there was, of course, this idea that the solution to this problem would be resolved somewhere else outside of Europe, which was premised on a 19th century European and Western, American, I would say as well, idea that non-Western peoples were simply disposable, that their lands were not theirs, in any historically significant sense. And so the Palestinians, who had been on their land for centuries, were essentially deemed a people without history. And so they were moved out, and they were, or the idea was that they could be moved out because they were historically, this is the European and the Zionist thinking, they were Palestinians, in other words, whether they're Muslims or Christians, were historically insignificant. That was the idea. So there was an erasure, a metaphorical erasure of the Palestinians, of their history, of their humanity, of their religions, of their culture, as anything significant. And so there's a double play. And then, of course, there's the question that again, moving the story forward, after World War II, of course, and the Nazi genocide, the Holocaust, against European Jews, the Western world then said, well, in reaction to this Western genocide, German genocide against the Jews, this horror of Nazism, we need to make atonement, we need to sort of atone for this horror, and so we're going to help create this Jewish state. But of course, what was unsaid was that it was going to come at the expense of the Palestinians, not at the expense of the Germans, or at the expense of Europeans, who had been the main force for anti-Semitism. And that sort of notion and that logic that Palestinians were to pay for European anti-Semitism, pay the price for the atonement. The Jews obviously paid for European anti-Semitism first and foremost, but then the Palestinians were made to pay the price for a European sense of atonement, for their own horrors and their own history, again, because of the fact that they viewed Palestinians as an indigenous native people who historically were not that significant. And so in that sense, that erasure, that denial of the Palestinians, of their history, the history of the Middle East, the history of coexistence, all that was an essential part of how Zionism came to be seen in the West as an ethical and moral movement, because it's premised on erasing the Palestinians. And what you see today is that students finally, and people finally are waking up and realizing this is not acceptable. It's not acceptable to atone for the crimes of Europeans at the expense of the third people, the Palestinians. And that's where we are today.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things you said today at Georgetown was, there's a question that nobody asks, is why didn't Zionism, or a movement for Jewish nationalism, begin in the region among Jews who were living there? It came from Europe. And that sort of illuminates a lot of sort of the, I think, chaos around this question.
Yeah, that's I mean, in my recent book, that's one of the points that I made, that Zionism, it's interesting. There were Jewish, and there have been Jewish communities that are, of course, indigenous to the Middle East. There's no doubt about that. Jews, Muslims, Christians, others have been part of the Middle East for centuries and centuries and centuries. And, and it's really important to underscore and emphasize that point. Yet Zionism, despite what people today say, Zionism did not emerge among the Jewish communities of the Middle East. It emerged in Europe, responding to European questions, advocated first by Christian Zionists and then also by Jewish Zionists, Ashkenazi Jewish Zionists, who wanted to create a Jewish state. And they wanted to create a Jewish state outside of Europe to become, in a sense, part of Europe. But the point is, it did not emerge among the Jewish communities of the Middle East, the ancient, historic, indigenous communities of the Middle East, Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, because there was no Jewish question in the Middle East. The Jewish question, in quotations, was a European question. It was European racism, it was European anti-Semitism, and that's why Zionism emerges in Europe and then proposes a European solution, i.e. colonialism, in Palestine. So I think these questions are absolutely essential to understand where Zionism comes from, that it's not to be conflated with Judaism, and certainly not to be conflated with the Jewish communities in the Middle East. I think these are really crucial points.
Okay, so speaking about the liberal component of this, one of the things that I've been trying to understand is post-October the 7th, how does one explain the liberal silence, or in many cases complicity with the horrors of Gaza. And in my own mind, I've tried to break it down into sort of three components. I wanted to get your thoughts on this. Tell me what I'm missing in this analysis. The first idea is, I think liberals, broadly speaking, are motivated by an impulse about the very horrific legacy of anti-Semitism, the horrors of the Holocaust, and that's something that shapes how they respond to this particular issue, point number one. The second point being, I think the very powerful influence of a pro-Israel lobby that sort of, has a lot of resources to police the debate on Israel-Palestine. And so if you're a liberal and you're going to speak out on this, you're going to get called an anti-Semite, and that's sort of the worst thing that in many ways could be said to someone, so that keeps people in line. And the last one is one that I think is also part of the debate. I think when many liberals look to the Middle East, look at Israel and Palestine, they sort of, I think, see the Israel side of this debate as the representation of sort of modernity, progress, democracy, and the Palestinians as the antithesis of that. They're backward, they're violent, they're irrational, etc. And so those are the three sort of, I think, themes that seem to be shaping and maybe perhaps broadly explain why mainstream liberal voices, governments, have been so horrific in their response to October the 7th. Do you agree with that framing? What's missing?
Well, I mean, it's not that anything is missing. What's missing, of course, is the Palestinians and their history and their humanity and the fact that they are completely outside of this framework. And so liberalism has always been sort of entrammelled or part of the Western Empire. The British Empire, for example, the discourse of liberalism in the 19th century was predicated on this idea that some peoples were more worthy, more capable, more able to be liberal citizens, and others, i.e. the non-West, especially the Indians, but Africans, Arabs, and so on, were not at that sort of requisite civilizational level. And so the whole point of the British Empire was to raise people up in theory and in principle. That was all. So liberalism has always had a racist dimension to it in terms of the theorization. That's the theory part. And then you have the point about liberals after World War II, when confronting the horrors of the Holocaust and the horrors of anti-Semitism and the horrors of World War II, frankly, and the destruction of Europe, and the realization that this world that they had celebrated so strongly had come down on itself in such a horrific way, and the other peoples, of course. The idea was that we need to make atonement for this, and the way we atone for this is creating a Jewish state. The premise of this, of course, is that those people who were there, the native populations, were not civilizationally or culturally or historically or religiously significant enough so that they could be somehow marginalized, and that story, their story, Palestinian history, Palestinian lives, Palestinian memories, Palestinian homes, Palestinian everything, society, was somehow less important than the more important story in the view of liberals, which was the redemption for the history, the European Western history of anti-Semitism. So that connection is very powerful.
Can we think about liberalism not as sort of having this ugly, dark, racist side towards non-Western people? I mean, just to cite an example, your uncle, for example, Edward Said was a liberal in my view. I mean, he was trained in liberal institutions. He, I think, in many ways embodied the best sort of representation of Western liberalism, secular humanism, which can be found in other faith traditions. But there is this, I mean, say an organization like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty, those are liberal institutions. They draw upon the same sort of liberal ideals, but reach very different conclusions when it comes to the humanity of the Palestinians. So how do we sort of, think about these two strands of liberalism?
Well, I think there's a difference between secular humanism and European liberalism that was predicated on a hierarchy, a racial hierarchy. So the first thing, of course, is that liberalism, like the idea of civilization, like the idea of progress, like the idea of modernity, like the idea of justice, like the idea of humanity, most of all, you can interpret it in a racist way and have a racial hierarchy and say, yes, there are many different forms of humanity, and some are better, some are less, which is the European 19th century way, and the American way, frankly, that ultimately leads to segregation and to all these horrific systems of injustice. Or you believe, like my uncle did, and like many people do, which is to say that no, there is something that has to be reinterpreted. There's a secular humanism where everybody is actually fundamentally equal, and that every history is equal in a certain kind of way. And you either believe that or don't believe that. And once you believe that, you reinterpret what secular humanism means. And the whole point of Secular humanism is that people of any faith tradition, of any historical tradition, can engage in a kind of real, not a fake dialogue, a real dialogue based on a certain core principles of equality. And that's, I think, in that sense you can recuperate it to an extent, but you can't deny the history of European racism or American racism.
So your last book is here, and I want to ask you a question on the book, The Age of Coexistence, where you take on perhaps one of the most powerful Western myths about the Middle East and the Arab world as allegedly being this timelessly tribal, war-torn region driven by ancient ethnic and sectarian divides and hatreds. I mean, you've talked a little bit about historic Jewish-Arab relations prior to 1948, but could you give us a broader overview of what coexistence looked like in the Middle East prior to 1948? Because in many ways, it's an inspiring history that most Americans don't know, and it gives us a sense of a possibility of a better future.
Yeah, and I would say not just most Americans, I would say most people, including most Arabs, no longer know, in the sense that we have been indoctrinated to think, both as Arabs, to loathe ourselves and loathe our history and be ignorant, frankly, of our history and our culture, but also as Americans to have an ignorance about other cultures. So very simply, the bottom line is that there is a history, an extraordinary history of coexistence that needs to be historicized, that needs to be sort of narrated with empathy, and to understand that coexistence is not the same over time. Coexistence can be with equality, can be without equality. It changes over time. So that in the earlier periods, there certainly was toleration of non-Muslims in Muslim societies, in the Arab world, for sure, and in Islamic societies, but that's not the same thing as equality. And so a good historian, an honest historian would say, let's narrate this history, but also understand that people are not just Muslims and Christians and Jews, they're also from various cities, from various neighborhoods, from various professions, from various families. And so there's a whole spectrum of life that is so extraordinarily beautiful and complicated that we have lost sight of in the way we stereotype the Middle East as simply being Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or Sunni and Shia. You see what I'm saying? And so people are not one-dimensionally anything. But when we come to the Middle East for shorthand, we just say, oh, they're just X, Y, and Z, and we leave it at that. And that's absurd. That's fundamentally doing a massive disservice to an extraordinary history, especially the history of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish coexistence, that is centuries old, and it's far older than it is in the West. And yet, so in the West, for example, you have racism. You have an extraordinary history of racism, of segregation, of slavery, and yet people here in America say, but we can still somehow transcend that history as Americans. Europeans have an extraordinary history of anti-Semitism, of anti-Catholic violence, of anti-Protestant violence, of anti-colonial violence, of all sorts, and yet the Europeans today say, well, we can transcend that. So, well, in the Middle East, we can do the same. I mean, there's no difference. Obviously, there's no difference, except for the fact that our history of coexistence in terms of Muslim, Christian, Jewish history is, in fact, quite deep and requires more study. But before you can study it, you have to be open to the idea that these people are people. And so, for example, my brother and I, we come from a Christian Arab background. There's no, in the Arab world today, you can be a Muslim Arab, nobody bats an eyelid. You can be a Christian Arab and nobody bats an eyelid anymore. You say Jewish Arab, people say, wait, that doesn't make sense. The only reason that doesn't make sense is because of colonial Zionism in the Middle East and because of European colonialism in North Africa, which was based on the idea of divide and rule, and convincing people that you don't belong to this tradition, you belong to a different tradition. You see what I'm saying? So again, coexistence is complicated. It should be studied without denial. There's nothing to be ashamed of. And there is violence, of course, but there's a whole other history in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in all the countries that we talk, in Palestine, in Egypt, that is something that is quite extraordinary and that we barely know. We've barely scratched the surface, hence Age of Coexistence. And that the point of that is to say that there's this extraordinary tradition. In the 19th century, the question was, how do you translate this tradition of coexistence into a new political ethos of equality? Because it's one thing to coexist without equality. It's another thing to say, okay, how do we translate that into equal citizenship? And, the Arab East, what is today Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, Egypt, this whole region, the Mashriq, was a place where Muslims and Christians and Jews, had it not been for Zionism, worked together in an extraordinary way to develop an ecumenical culture, by which I mean a sense of being Ottoman or Arab that recognized religious difference and transcended it, in the sense of saying we can be Jewish and Muslim and Christian and also be Arab or be Ottoman or be whatever. You see what I'm saying? That was a project that should have and could have and would have developed more. But then colonial Zionism, remember, answering European questions coming from Europe, backed by European empires, came in and devastated Palestine.
And how do we get back to that age of coexistence? I mean, my sense is the only way forward is through processes of democratization, inclusion, citizenship laws, the ending of wars, change foreign policies, economic hope for a better future, all of those things, right?
Yeah, I mean, evidently, all those things, but you can't ever go back. There's nothing to go back to as such. But what you can do is learn from your history, and like anything, I mean, history is about telling a story. It's also about recognizing what parts of the historical tradition are worth reimagining in a new way. And especially, so anything starts with imagination. If you start with the idea that you can't ever coexist, well, you're doomed to a certain kind of politics. If you start, however, with the insistence, which I actually totally believe in, that there is nothing intrinsically separating Muslim and Christian and Jew in the Middle East. Historically speaking, there is nothing that's intrinsic in this. And in fact, that's what all the campsites here, all the encampments that we see, in which you have Jewish students, you have Muslim students, you have Christian students, Buddhists, Hindus, all sorts of different people who are working together, hand in hand, precisely because they believe in something that transcends their difference. Well, the same thing in the Middle East.
Okay, one last question, and we'll turn it over to the audience. And Ussama is still on West Coast time. He's got an early morning flight, so I want to make sure he gets some sleep tonight before he has to head home. One of the things that I ask every time I'm in conversation with a Palestinian intellectual, I ask them to reflect upon the crisis of Palestinian leadership, the crisis of Palestinian national leadership, the effective absence of a Palestinian national leadership that can lead the Palestinians out of the horrors that we're seeing in Gaza, but going back really much earlier. And so this is something that your late uncle spoke eloquently about in the last decade of his life. How do Palestinians create the type of representative, incorruptible, effective leadership that can provide the type of leadership that any national liberation movement needs in order to achieve self-determination? I mean, ideally speaking, what we need, in my reading, is we need a Palestinian equivalent of an African National Congress that is representative, that has a vision, that can sort of lay out a strategy. What we have right now is a corrupt dictator in Ramallah backed by the United States and the Israelis, and you have a lot of people saying, yes, we need a leadership. But you would think that at a moment like this, a second Nakba would produce the type of organization and mobilization among Palestinian communities to produce that type of leadership that could lead to self-determination and to the end of the horrors that we've been seeing for far too long. So could you reflect on this particular problem facing the Palestinian national movement, the absence of leadership, and what could change to change that equation?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say, of course, is that I'm not presumptuous enough to tell you how this is going to. I don't know. I mean, the answer is I have no idea about what is going to happen. I mean, that's the only. I'm a historian, and I'm not just hiding behind history. But what I would say is that history teaches us that the Palestinians did in the 1960s did develop a national movement. It was called the PLO, and it came out of a time, after being smashed as a people, as a society. After the Nakba in 1948, when the entire society was dispersed, when the society was destroyed, when land was taken away, when Palestine was literally erased from the map, and Israel was created and the Palestinians were made a stateless people, it took them a decade and more just to reassemble as a people under the leadership of the PLO. And so Yasser Arafat, for all his ills, and Sadi and I, my brother and I, were talking about this the other day, for all the ills of the PLO, in the end it was a national movement. Right. How that's going to be reconstituted, I don't know. But the point is that what's beautiful about history and politics is that the unimaginable, Sadi was just talking about William Blake earlier, becomes imaginable very quickly. And we can't predict how or when. But there's certainly no question, there's a lot of incredible energy that you see around this country. around many parts of the world, including in the Arab world. What's missing right now is a leadership. But first of all, right now we're in a moment of just survival. First they have to survive this onslaught. That's the key point right now. Then we'll see. And then the question is, how is this genocide going to end? On what terms? There's so many factors that need to be clarified before anyone can give you an honest answer about the question.
Okay, great. Let's open the floor to questions, comments. I'll take them three at a time. 1, 2, 3, and then we'll move to the back of the room. Go ahead.
Thank you. So
Can you come to the front and speak in the microphone?
let me see if I have one.
Do you have? Yeah, while he's looking for one, just ask the questions.
There's one right
Go that far.
My question is this: so you started talking about the European problem and the European solution, and which it didn't work. But right now, also your language. I don't mean the English. Your academic language, your episteme. It's all European, and you are coming from a European tradition. All this decolonial language, epistemology, it's European. So how come you expect us? And also you wanted democracy, representative democracy, and I'm not against it. I'm just like bringing the point. In the Middle East as a solution. These are all European solutions. So why do you think a European solution that didn't work in the case of Zionism and so on would work in this case of liberal democracy? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I don't think that everything we say is European. There's also, as I said, we have our own history of coexistence, which has nothing to do with Europe as such. There's an incredible history of anti-colonialism that's not European at all. In fact, it's the antithesis of Europe. On the other hand, Europe and America are part of any world that we're going to shape, whether we like it or not. I mean, that's a reality. The point is that there are different aspects of Europe. Europe also changes. So does the US. And the encampments we see here across this country, the students we see here, are in fact a testament to how things change in the US as well as in other parts of the world. There's nothing static, neither about the Arab world, nor Europe, but there are traditions. And the question is, how do you harness the positive traditions of these societies and make them work together? Because there's no future for Palestine without also a future for the Israelis who are there. The question is, how do you dismantle the apartheid system, the system of inequality, the system of incredible, grotesque injustice, like genocide now in Gaza? How does this system end, and how do you create a better system? And that's not a system that's either going to be Arab or Western or European. And I don't believe at all in a sort of a monocultural, epistemic sort of solution that draws only on one tradition, whether it's an Islamic tradition or a Western. These things don't make sense to me anymore. But there are traditions. There is an Arab Islamic tradition that one can harness elements of to build a better future, contribute to a better future. But the more fundamental question is, justice is not a Western episteme. It's not. It's in the Islamic tradition, and it's in many traditions. I'm sorry. And equality is a political question that's universal. As is citizenship. These are universal, as is the future. These are all questions that every society struggles with.
Yeah, there are universal values, in other words, that one can draw upon that I think cross cultures. I think this woman right here has her hand up here. This woman. Sorry, I forgot.
My name is Azita. I'm totally agree with everything you said. In the respect to the Jewish question in Europe, where is the Balfour Treaty, which is in 1917, connected to the 1948 or 1947 or 1945? Is it to be related to the crusade or the agenda, which is even way before they planned this, to get rid of the Jewish question in Europe? Because I read the marks about that and many other scholars regarding the Jewish question in Europe.
So the question is about the Balfour Declaration?
Yes, the connection.
The Balfour Declaration, obviously in November 1917, when the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour pledges the support of the British Empire, the British government supporting the Zionist projects in Palestine. And of course, it's explicitly based in 1917 on a racial hierarchy. Obviously, because it talks about the Jewish people versus non-Jewish communities, even though in Palestine, the Palestinians, the Arabs, were the vast majority of the population, they're not referred to by what they are, but what they're not. Non-Jewish communities, as opposed to the Jewish people. which is in the text of the Balfour Declaration. So the racism and the hierarchy is in there. But also, as you're saying, there's no question that a lot of the support, especially by Christian statesmen in Europe, was premised on the idea of resolving the so-called Jewish question, which, remember, is a European question. There was no Jewish question in the Arab world or in the Islamic world. That doesn't exist. It's a European question. And the European question, the solution, conveniently for them, was creating a Jewish state outside of Europe and relocating Jews from Europe and the West to the non-West. So in that sense, there's a very powerful historic connection between Christian Zionists, anti-Semitism, and philo-Zionism. You see what I'm saying? This is a very complicated question that scholars have studied in depth at this point. And so there's a lot of course, Orientalism, anti-Arab racism, for sure, anti-Islamic racism, for sure, built into the Balfour Declaration, but there's also anti-Semitism built into it, and that's why the only Jewish member of the wartime cabinet, Edwin Montagu, was opposed to the Balfour Declaration, was opposed to Zionism, because he said this is basically a movement that's aiming to move Jews out of Europe and make them citizens somewhere else, and he refused to accept that. And so I think it's important to understand this and underscore this, and see the complexity and the different motivations as to why different Christians, different Europeans, and different Americans supported Zionism. But the bottom line of all their support was the idea that Palestinians were invisibilized and immaterial.
Sorry, somebody, who was the third hand of that record? Yeah, right there.
Thank you for being here tonight. My family's from Ramallah, and so you keep talking about the European empires, but I think specifically about the role of British Empire. Very specifically, that the British had a role in encouraging the immigration to the Middle East, and to, once after the Nakba, the banking system devaluing the Palestinian dollar and basically creating a permanent refugee underclass that, frankly, all the other Arab nations haven't done much about. And people say to me constantly, where are the other Arab nations in this crisis? And we know that the biggest source of corruption in any country is lack of safeguards, lack of rule of law. And I remember when Hamas was being voted in, I remember reading letters from people coming from Ramallah saying, what choice do we have? We're so desperate. Fatah's doing nothing for us. What choice do we have to try something different? We're desperate. So I'm just wondering what you think about those questions.
Those are a lot of questions. I salute Ramallah and everyone from Ramallah, but I think the question really is, there's no question that the British have played a catastrophic role. It's not just Europeans, it's the British specifically. In the case of Palestine, supporting colonial Zionism in Palestine, the Balfour Declaration, the structure of the mandate. I encourage everyone to go read about this history because it's foundational. How you make sense of what's going on today depends almost entirely on how you narrate the past and where you start the story. That's why history is important. Where you start the story tells you how you're going to make sense of what's going on today, because there's a linkage. And there's no question that the British helped the Zionists for all sorts of reasons, including anti-Semitic reasons, but imperial reasons as well as Christian philo-Semitic reasons, as well as just the base bottom line of not taking Palestinians seriously, seeing them as a people without history. All these combined into the creation of the British Mandate, which privileged the Zionists from Europe structurally, economically, politically, administratively, educationally, and so on and so forth, and allowed the Zionists to develop a state within a state, which is a term that the British themselves used to describe the Zionist movement. It's so ironic that the Israelis would then eventually talk about the PLO as a state within a state. That's a different story. Nevertheless, so they were encouraged by the terms of the British mandate to create a Jewish state, the proto-institutions of a Jewish state. The Palestinians, however, were repressed. They weren't allowed to develop secular institutions. They weren't allowed to develop Arab or Palestinian institutions, ecumenical institutions. Those were all suppressed. All they were allowed was to create a Supreme Muslim Council under British control. And so the British played an extraordinarily negative role and a damaging role, and they kept lying and saying there's no contradiction between supporting Zionism and supporting Palestinian civil and religious rights. Well, and then they eventually said, oh no, I'm sorry, we made a mistake, it's wrong, and we wash our hands and we turn it over to the UN. The British played and they've never been held to account, by the way, the British.
Yeah.
They created a huge mess, a massive problem that was so predictable, and that Palestinians said from day one is unjust, and that the British then, walked away. The same way the US walks away from Afghanistan, walks away from Iraq, walks away from many places. The devastation is left there. So history doesn't end. Colonialism never ends when the colonizer leaves. The wreckage continues. The effects continue. So that's the answer. In terms of the Arab states, I think I understand what you're saying, and I understand the anger people have towards the Arab states, especially today. Because today, it's a scandal today. There's no doubt about it. The British, again, you have to understand that the British created the modern Arab state system that we have today. The British described as an Arab facade. That's the term they used after World War I. An Arab facade. In other words, we're going to have Arab rulers behind which we're going to continue to control and dominate this region. But that way, it seems like the natives are running the show. But in fact, we're running the show. That Arab facade continues today. It's no longer the British who run the show, it's the US that has paramount influence in many different ways. Nevertheless, despite that, I think it's really important to emphasize that Arab peoples and Muslim peoples, beginning really from the Balfour Declaration onwards, but especially with the advent of radio in the 1930s, began to take the Palestinian question very seriously. And it became a core aspect of modern Arab identity. And it's one of the things that defines being Arab. And I don't know how many are Arabs in this room. An Arab, like a Muslim, I would say more generally, knows instinctively that Palestine is a question of right and wrong. You don't need to argue. You don't need to explain to people what Palestine, they know. You just say Palestine, people understand. That doesn't mean, however, they agree about what to do. And there's a huge difference between recognizing a cause as just and then saying, okay, so what resources are we going to devote to rectifying the injustices of Palestine? Don't forget, the Arab states fought in 48, they lost. Egypt was invaded in 56, most people don't know about that, and was devastated. Egypt and Syria and Jordan were overrun in 67 by Israel, and they lost a huge amount of territory in 67. Egypt and Syria fought in 73. So it's not like the Arab states haven't fought. They have fought. They've been defeated at the level of states, because in the end, Israel has been backed by the US, especially after 67. And in the end, they're states, and they have their own narrow parochial interests. So there's no question about, so I don't want to defend the Arab states. I'm not trying to defend, I'm just trying to say that there's a much more complex history of Arab states that are, on the one hand, dependent utterly on the West, and on the other hand, there is popular support for Palestine. And there's this contradiction of what to do. And so I think, and today it's actually scandalous, because the Arab states are so completely separated from their people's aspirations. And that's why you see Egypt playing the role it's playing, the UAE playing the role it's playing, the Saudis playing the role they're playing. It is a scandal. I agree with you completely.
Let's take questions at the back and then we'll move forward, because I want to make sure everyone in there. Yeah, gentlemen right at the back, number 1, 2, and 3, and then I'll move over to that side of the room. There it is.
Okay. First, I want to say I love your podcast. Thank you very much for doing it. I'm a real fan. I have a question that may be simplistic, but I would love to hear your thoughts on it. In this country, the word anti-Semitic is a very, very loaded term, and it's used to conflate anti-Zionism and anti-Jewishness or anti-Judaism. When people tell me about anti-Semitism, first of all, I'm Semitic, I'm a Lebanese Arab. I tell them that's the wrong word, And I say, if you mean that I'm anti-Zionist, tell me I'm anti-Zionist. If you mean that I'm anti-Jewish, tell me I'm anti-Jewish, but don't use the word anti-Semitic. What do you think about that? Is that just too simplistic?
Thank you. I mean, I think obviously the fact that they're accusing you of anti-Semitism, I mean, they accuse a lot of people of anti-Semitism. They accuse our students of being anti-Semitic. They accuse me of being an anti-Semite. They accuse my brother. They accuse almost anyone who speaks out on behalf of Palestine and justice and equality as being anti-Semitic. And of course, that's a way of trying to defame you, intimidate you, conflate you with the real anti-Semites out there. So obviously it's mischievous. Obviously it's designed to intimidate and to silence, ultimately. The answer to that, of course, is to say, first of all, it's absurd. There have always been Jews who have been opposed to Zionism. We, in fact, separate Judaism from Zionism. We actually don't make that conflation. A, B, there's a whole history of coexistence. C, there's the crucial point is that we're for justice, liberty. At least I am. I don't know you well. I don't know you, so, but I'll speak for myself. I'm for justice and equality. And if justice and equality, make me an anti-Semite, you need to redefine what you mean by anti-Semitism, because it's absurd. I am the real fight against anti-Semitism is also the fight for Palestinian liberation. You shouldn't make one opposed to the other. That's the answer, honestly. And as soon as you know the history, as soon as you go into the history, as soon as you tell them, what is it that you're advocating exactly? If you're advocating justice and equality and love, that's certainly not anti-Semitism.
So how do you respond to the mainstream argument that you hear, like, look, there's anti-Semitism, Jews need a state of their own because of the history, and so we have to support a Jewish state because of the problem?
I think, well, first of all, the answer is twofold. First of all, understand that this Jewish state came at the expense of the Palestinians. B, it's talking about creating an ethno-religious national state in a multi-religious land. C, 20% of the citizens of Israel, not even talking about the Palestinians in the camps or in the West Bank or in East Jerusalem or in Gaza, but inside Israel itself, what became the state of Israel itself, 20% of the population are Palestinian survivors of the Nakba and their descendants. They have and deserve every right to be equal. And a Jewish state, by definition, makes non-Jewish people unequal. That's not acceptable. It's not acceptable there, it's not acceptable here. And so the argument of saying that there should be a Jewish state, in theory, in principle, fine if that's what you want, but not in a utopia, but not in a land which is mixed, because unless you're willing to accept that some people are more deserving of rights than others, it's not right or fair that somebody from Ramallah, or my mother, who's from Jerusalem, or Palestinians who have an attachment to the land, that have been to this land, that have been part of this land for centuries and centuries, don't have a right to go back to their homes. But a Jewish person in America who has no relationship historically, but as in the last centuries, to this land can go back by virtue of being Jewish, but because I'm not Jewish, I can't go back. That's not right. That's not just. And that's not equality. So the argument of saying there should be a Jewish state, if the Germans want to make that argument, Germans can make sacrifices in Germany. But I don't think anyone should say they're for the atonement of a history of anti-Semitism at the expense of the third people. The atonement to anti-Semitism is a fight against racism in all its forms, and the creation of a secular state for all peoples.
Yeah, the gentleman right there, you've got the microphone.
Hi, Michael Buer, thank you so much. Saw you wrote over GWU, wonderful, thank you. I have Ashkenazi heritage, and it's very clear that there's settler colonialist strongly roots and framework for what we have as modern Israel. But almost half the Jews in modern Israel are Mizrahi and Sephardic. And, I can talk to Ashkenazis about settler colonialism, but the Mizrahis and the Sephardics, I don't know the history really well. The Palestinians have really been screwed over also by all these Jews coming in from Arab and neighboring lands. So Zionism emerged first in Europe, but it emerged also in the region as maybe a European infection. I don't quite understand the dynamics here, but it's complicated by this half the population now of Jews.
Not really. Yes, I see. So the point you're making, of course, is well taken in the sense that, yes, there obviously are what Israel calls Mizrahi Jews, i.e. Eastern Jews, Jews of the East. There's no question. There are Sephardic Jews, there are Arab Jews, there are many different kinds of Jews who were indigenous to the region, whether from Iraq or Morocco or Yemen or wherever they were from, who ended up in Israel after 1948. So you're right about that. That doesn't take away from the fact that Zionism emerged in Europe. It really doesn't take away from that fact. That's a central, essential fact that one has to underscore to understand just how foreign it was to this part of the world and to the rhythms of coexistence in this part of the world. So either the Middle East, not this part of the world, I mean Palestine. So that's point number one. Point number two, just because it emerged in Europe, it eventually became a successful in quotations, colonial enterprise, and like any successful enterprise, it attracted adherents. Especially when it told people, you have a choice. You're either Jewish or you're Arab. You can't be both. That's what Zionism tells people. You cannot be both. You have to choose. So people choose. Especially when the Arab states, after 48, Iraq and other states, adopted atrocious policies towards their Jewish communities. But rather than say the experience and what happened to the Jewish communities in Iraq especially, Baghdad, which had a huge Jewish community, and suffered from persecution after, or at least sort of suffered from discrimination after 48, and even earlier, even in 41, in the Farhud. The point is not to deny this, but to understand that what happened to the Jews of Iraq and Morocco and other places was predicated and part and parcel of the same story that began with the dispossession of the Palestinians. And had there not been colonial Zionism, there would never have been this choice they would have to make. That's the point to emphasize. You see what I'm saying? So in other words, again, it goes back, yes, of course there are many sort of Mizrahi Jews today in Israel, but there are many black Americans who are part of America. And there are many indigenous Americans who are Native Americans who are US citizens. And there are many Arab Americans and many different Americans who were once and still, in a sense, victimized by the American system, who are part of the American system. That's part of the history and the consequences of the history that we're talking about. But the essential part is not to miss the crucial fact that Zionism was responding to European questions and proposing European solutions, i.e. colonialism and racial hierarchies in the non-West. Predicated on not just that Palestinian history doesn't matter, but that Eastern Jewish history is also irrelevant in a sense. Because there's a hierarchy, even in Israel. Ashkenazi Jews, Mizrahi Jews. And so their politics of resentment then gets translated into looking down on the Palestinians even more. Do you see what I'm saying? So there's a whole complicated history, but scholars have written about this, so I can refer you to some books.
Yeah. Next question right there. Go ahead.
Thank you so much.
You know what? Do you want to come to the front? Just use this microphone so everyone can hear you. Just come to the front. You're halfway there. Just put it closer. Put it closer.
Thank you so much. I have a question about archives, and I've learned so much again from your podcast, and you had a really rich one on memory and carrying memories and memories as archives. But it's a question, just a factual question about the decimation of all of the universities in Gaza, all cultural institutions targeted and so on. What has actually happened to the archives? Where are the main Palestinian archives? And obviously, we're looking way beyond the end of this genocide, but are historians already thinking about how we reconstruct these? Are there virtual copies? Are there ways of thinking about this maybe akin to what has happened in Ireland with the explosion of 4 courts and the destruction of all their records and their virtual recreation that's going on now? So that kind of...
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I can't really answer the question because I don't know, other than saying a couple of things. First of all, of course, once Palestine was no longer a state, in other words, when Palestine was destroyed in 1948, the state repository doesn't exist as such, and that is a main archive for a lot of states around the world, including the US, the national archives, and so on and so forth. So that's already missing. Second of all, the records that were lost in the Nakba in 1948, a lot of them are lost. There's a lot that's been lost, a lot that was seized by the state of Israel and then relocated to the Israeli archives. So the Israeli National Library, for example, has a whole print runs of Palestinian newspapers and so on and so forth, as well as books and libraries that were confiscated from Palestinians and from Palestinian homes and put in the Israeli archives and national libraries. So there's a whole sort of history right there of archives that were taken, relocated expropriated, and so on, and also archives that were lost entirely, manuscripts that were destroyed. You know, that happens in these wars. In Gaza, of course, we're talking about the obliteration, the complete annihilation, the obliteration of every university in Gaza, of archives, of cultural centers, and a lot has been lost permanently. I mean, any historian knows this. Any person seeing the damage in Gaza, the utter Israeli deliberate annihilation of Gaza, the deliberate targeting of intellectuals, of universities, of archives, of libraries, that has consequences. That doesn't mean that people can't recreate something. There are always recreations. How, when, to be determined, honestly. I can't in good conscience tell you because I don't know. But I know that the PLO developed in the 60s and 70s, it developed an archive, which the Israelis came in 1982, said, am I right, and confiscated and took back to Israel. And so, you know, the archive is not something, records of the past, it's also how you want to recreate and rethink the past in the future. And that's to be determined. The point is you can destroy archives, you can destroy buildings, you can destroy people, but you can't, the Israelis are not going to succeed as much as they try, and they've destroyed every university in Gaza, they're not going to be able to destroy a Palestinian will to recreate and to rebuild, and ultimately, and this whole genocide is about. Part of it is a desperation on the part of Israel. You can destroy, you can annihilate, but the question is the Palestinians are still there. There's still 2 million Palestinians in Gaza alone, the Gaza Strip alone. What's going to happen? You know, they're traumatized for sure, but I'm almost certain that universities will be rebuilt. How, when, that's a different question. I don't know.
Let's take 3 questions. I'm going to go. Okay, is it working? Let's start to the very right of the room. So, 1, the gentleman by the wall. 2, and then the man with the hat, number 3, and I'll get to you next, number 4.
Hi, thanks for this very thoughtful discussion. So my questions, I think, going back to one of the first questions, which was about liberalism and critiques of liberalism and maybe strategic liberalism. You know, as a person living in the West today, Western liberal democracy, and witnessing the injustice of the Palestinians, the historic injustice, the indifference of, you know, institutions, universities, governments that claim to be liberal, I see roughly 2 kinds of responses to this among, ordinary people who are observing this and concerned. One is that, you know, the accusation of hypocrisy, that if liberalism was really held to its own highest standards, the Palestinians would get justice, and the West would give them justice. And the other is a critique that says, essentially, this is not about hypocrisy, this is about hierarchy. That liberalism masks these kinds of injustices. And, you know, the purpose of a system is what the system does, this sort of approach. And my question to you isn't sort of like which one's true or not, but how should we orient ourselves around this question? And do strategic elements come into play?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and I think the answer is both, and that's not a cop-out. In the sense, you're absolutely right. Obviously, for example, the legal system is set up and designed to protect, in a sense, the status quo. That doesn't mean the legal system doesn't change. It doesn't mean that we haven't moved way beyond where the Supreme Court was in Jim Crow, upholding Jim Crow or upholding slavery, or, you see what I'm saying, segregation. Things change. Things are always changing and evolving. And yes, liberalism is about hierarchy at one level. There's no question that's the origins of liberalism. On the other, it doesn't mean things don't change and evolve. That's the whole point of being people in history, is that we change, we evolve. This kind of gathering would have been unimaginable 100 years ago. Things change. So, but the point is to be aware of the history, to be aware of the limits of liberalism, not to put your hopes only in governments, and to understand that governments, as my brother Sadi always reminds me, governments, especially the US government, will be the last place to change. Will be the last place to change. Because they are absolutely invested in the status quo. That's what they do. But that doesn't mean that they're impervious to change and they can't change, because they have changed, whether they like it or not. And there's a movement developing on campuses now You could see that as a bellwether of change. Students typically tend to be, in a sense, ahead. And what students do, it takes a generation, but it's going to change. And so I will not be surprised. I will not be surprised, despite all the denialism of Palestinian history that I've been talking about, and that's been an essential part of the colonial Zionist enterprise in Palestine. I will not be surprised as a result of the student movement, as a result of Palestinian existence, as a result of Palestinian, resistance in the sense of insisting on their right to life and their belonging to Palestine, that you're going to see, in fact, in the very near future, an ever more wider embrace of being Palestinian. Because something is changing. There's a generational change taking place. I feel it among my students. 25 years ago, when we were teaching, we started teaching, my brother a little older than me, 28 years ago, or 29 years ago in his case, you couldn't really, you would have to argue the case for Palestinian history. Now when I start teaching my course, almost all my students come in already conscious of that there are Palestinians and there's a cause out there. Something is changing. Let's see what the effects are.
Gentleman with the glasses, and then you're next, and then you're after that person.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring talk. I'd like you to go back to, as a historian, to what you said before, and to detail a bit more the status in Israel itself. Of course, even honest people, very liberal, would agree that in Gaza and in the West Bank, there is definitely apartheid. And what you seem to allude, and what certainly I believe, is that the system of Zionism is a system of apartheid. But as a historian, what can you say? At one point, we see the Supreme Court of Israel trying to settle things where all the citizens are considered equal, whether Arab or Jewish, and all of this. But can you shed a bit more light on this as a historian?
Yes, and not just as a historian. I mean, I would recommend, without sort of, despite the nepotism involved, or at least my brother Ussama Makdisi's book called "Tolerance is a Wasteland," where he actually, in detail, explores many of these issues. That the Israeli Supreme Court, for example, contrary to what you said, in fact says that there is no, in Israel, there is no, Sadi, correct me if I'm wrong, there is no nationality in Israel there is no nationality in Israel what is that?
There is no Jewish nation, there is no Israeli nation separate from the Jewish people.
Yeah, there is no Israeli nation separate from the Jewish people. So that in Israel, your rights accrue to you based, on the one hand, on citizenship, which is a more limited category, but also on your being Jewish. So you have a right to emigrate to Israel, not on the basis of being an Israeli citizen, as much as being a Jewish person. So you don't have to be Israeli, you have to be Jewish. Access to land, and so on, and the whole educational structure within the state of Israel clearly discriminates against Palestinians, even citizens. So yes, Palestinian citizens, the 20%, the survivors of the Nakba, their descendants, have certain rights as citizens, but these rights are abridged all the time. They have more rights than the Palestinians living under occupation in the West Bank, the residents in East Jerusalem, and the people who are being brutalized in the Gaza Strip. For sure, they have more rights, but they certainly don't have equal rights in the sense of the Israeli Zionist system. That's why Professor Nadira Sharif-Kevorkian, our colleague at Hebrew University, was just arrested and humiliated because she's Palestinian and because she dared say that she's for equality. And she was arrested and Hebrew University suspended her because, again, she's Palestinian, and she's a citizen. So don't get fooled by the citizenship part, because citizenship is not the same thing as equality.
Gentleman with the hat, and then the woman right in front of him.
Thank you. Hello? Yep, there it is. Yeah, hi.
No, yes, yes. Well, I agree that Zionism grew out of European anti-Semitism, but taking a page from Kanafani's On Zionist Literature, it also grew out of emancipation of the Jews. And that little book is kind of powerful, although he's not fully an historian, but he's so brilliant, right? And so that he says that Zionism grew out of a desire for power and a frustration at not having full status in Europe because the social prejudice and discrimination was quite severe. But he says it all came out of elites who were very assimilated, and they wanted the whole package of European goodies. And they were frustrated not to get it. And then they landed on the idea of nationalism for the Jews. And this went alongside with a contempt for traditional Jewish society. So, how does that help to explain things?
Is that the question?
Yeah, I would just say,
that sounds like a good question.
it's a partial. You've only given us a partial, and this explains the tremendous tensions in Israeli society, because the traditional ones are like, we're still here and we're going to take over. And also just these weren't people who were looking for a break, to please just let us have full equality. They decided to take it in a whole different direction and become full-fledged imperialist, hierarchical racists and join the club that way. Can you respond? A little rhetorical there, sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, but the point is that there's no question. I'm trying to remember what the question is.
What the different strands of Zionism?
Yeah, I mean,
and
there are different strands of Zionism. Kanafani has his reading of Zionism, and go back and read his work. But as you said, Kanafani was not a historian, but the insight he's bringing to us is the fact that Zionism, there certainly were class aspects to Zionism, no question about that. There were different forms of Zionism in Europe. There were different forms. There were different forms of Zionism in Europe, but when it came to the creation in Palestine of a Jewish nationalist project, there's no question that there were hierarchical tensions, there were class tensions, there were different tensions, there was a sense of contempt, not just for Palestinians, the natives obviously, but also for Eastern Jews, including traditional Jews, also of traditional Ashkenazis. There's no question, all these tensions are within Israeli society till today. Just like there is in many other kinds of societies. You have these kind of, the difference is that you're talking about a settler colonial society in the 21st century that's still playing, that's the amazing thing about Israel. That Israel, in what it's doing to Gaza and the West Bank, the pogroms in the West Bank, the whole idea of apartheid in the 21st century, what's amazing is that Israel is out of time in two senses. Out of time in the sense that there's an anachronism, that this is a settler colonial polity that really belongs in a different era. In terms of the idea of racial and religious hierarchies that Israel sort of proposes in the apartheid system that it enforces, different rules for different peoples based on different religions or different ethnicities, and on the other hand, out of time in the sense that people are finally waking up. Especially the younger generation is finally waking up to this, how intolerable it is to have a system of injustice being funded by US tax dollars in the 21st century, and our students of all faiths can see that, and that's what they're protesting against. So again, there's a lot of complexity in all these movements. There's a lot of history, but that shouldn't make us sort of hide behind our fingers and not see what is actually transpiring on the ground today, and try to do whatever we can to end this extraordinary state of injustice. That's where we are.
Okay, just raise your hand so we can get you the microphone. And we're going to start to wrap it up because I'm very conscious of the fact that our speaker is on West Coast time and he's got to fly back early in the morning. And I can see his eyes starting to sort of, suggest that he's tired. So go ahead with your question.
What I wanted to ask, to go back to your earliest comments about coexistence, was if you could talk about the role of nationalism in upsetting this coexistence.
That's a good question. That's a very complicated question because nationalism, again, you have to separate, I think, Western nationalisms, which were always predicated on forms of racism and colonial domination, because that's how they developed typically in the major Western states, whether Britain, France, or the United States, Canada, so on and so forth, Australia, New Zealand, etc., and Portugal and Spain, and we can go on, and nationalism in other parts of the world. So in the Middle East, nationalism, yes, there is a fundamental sort of intolerance of those who are considered to be outside the bounds of the nation for sure. But nationalism, whether it's in the Ottoman case, in the Arab East, or in the post-Ottoman Arab Mashriq, as in the post-Ottoman Arab East, nationalism was also a force of giving people this ability to transcend religious difference. In the sense of saying you can be an Ottoman Muslim, you can be an Ottoman Christian, you can be an Ottoman Jew. You can transcend these things by being Ottoman, which is why the fez, the tarbush, that felt hat, that was a modern Ottoman innovation in the 1820s that was designed to give people a sense of a common headdress that transcended religious difference, that marked you as a modern Ottoman. Today, of course, we think of it as an old person's hat, as our great-grandfathers or grandfathers' clothing, but it was initially a modern sort of sartorial development. So nationalism is also gives you a possibility of unifying and overcoming religious difference. So I think it depends on which nationalism where.
I was thinking also of Turkish nationalism.
Yeah, but Turkish nationalism is also very different from Arab nationalism, in the sense that Turkish post-war, post-Ottoman, post-World War I, Turkish nationalism developed in response to the end of the Ottoman Empire, developed in the context of the Armenian genocide, developed in the context of the Eastern question, developed in the context of European powers coming in and playing minorities against, groups against each other. And then Turkish nationalism, paradoxically or ironically or perversely, was secular under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, but at the same time incredibly intolerant of minorities. Against the Greeks, population exchange, the Armenians, of course, and Kurds, and Kizilba, and many different groups who were persecuted or were suppressed by the nationalizing Turkish state. So in the West, they celebrated it as secular, but of course denuded of diversity. In the Arab East, that's the point of the book actually as well, in the Arab East, we had the opposite. We in fact inherited the Ottoman tradition of diversity, but without a strong secular state. There wasn't this, the whole point of the Arab region is that there wasn't this kind of Kemalist-like state, like Turkish national state that went to war against minorities in the same way that the Turkish state did.
Last question at the back. Yes, stand up.
And I am from Qatar. I just want to say as an Arab, I am completely embarrassed and it hurts me to the bone to see the lack of response of our Arab leaders towards what is happening in Palestine. And I say this speaking for myself and perhaps some of the people in my circles and the people in the Arab world. There is this longing to King Faisal of Saudi Arabia and how he imposed an oil embargo in the 1970s on the West, on the US. And there was a very urgent response to that coming from the West because I guess it was unexpected, it was unprecedented. So had the Arab states today taken such a strong response, especially threatening with fossil fuels towards the US, towards Europe, do you think we'd still be talking about genocide today?
You're asking a really important question and a hypothetical question in the sense that, presumably, if we assume, if the assumption of the question is that Western states or any state, for example, any states respond to what they perceive to be their core interests. So there's no question, when the Arab states, and this is one of the lessons of the 20th century, when Arab nationalists, whether it was Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalizing the Suez Canal, or it was in Iran, Mossadegh nationalizing the Anglo-Iranian oil company, or when even the Saudis imposed the oil embargo in '73, they got a reaction from the Western states. There's no doubt about that. There's absolutely no doubt that they forced, in a sense, a reckoning with a cause and the people that had been denied. It didn't do enough. It didn't change enough because it was a very short-lived embargo and it was always conditional. Nevertheless, there's no question that the Western response was more more sustained. So if the Arab states today were to change, yes, there would be a different kind of debate. I think it's an absolute scandal that the Arab states that have, quote, normalized with Israel have not actually done anything they haven't recalled one of their ambassadors. That it's South Africa, and all credit to South Africa, that took the case to the ICJ. That it's Bolivia and Central American states that are the ones that have actually sort of made the case. And the Arab states have done nothing. This is the Arab states lack sovereignty. They profoundly are dependent. And ultimately, the Arab states represent dynastic interests of families and of despots who are far more concerned with their own survival and their own geopolitical reading and their own interests, even though they know that their populations, if left to their own devices, would be marched for Palestine. We know that. Again, that's part of history. It's one of those things you know as a historian, but also just being Arab, as I told you. Most Arabs, whether they're Muslim or Christian, whether they're rich or poor, whether they're Eastern or Western, whether they're from Morocco or Saudi Arabia, most Arabs understand intuitively Palestine is about justice and about injustice. Arab states, however, are something else. But that doesn't mean, just to end on a more positive note, that doesn't mean that just because right now we're in the situation we're in, that this won't change. Because again, nobody anticipated the 1952 revolution. Nobody anticipated the Arab Spring when it first burst out. Yes, these were repressed, or they changed, or they became corrupted, whatever, but the whole point of history is that things happen when we can't imagine them, and then they happen. That's why I would take everything that political scientists write and do, as well as historians, with a grain of salt. We should be humble enough to understand that we don't know what's going to happen. But when things change in Egypt, everything else will change. When things change in Jordan, everything else will change. When things change in the Gulf, everything else will change. So that's where we are.
Please join me in thanking Ussama Makdisi for being with us tonight. Thank you. And there's copies. I think you'll stay around for a few moments to sign copies of his books. There's other books on Palestine. And thank you again, Andy, for partnering with us. It's wonderful to be in partnership with you. Thank you all for coming.